May 1940. On paper, Europe is already lost. The Republic of Westphalia collapses in under a month. The armies of Westland fall in just 6 weeks. An entire expeditionary force is pushed into the sea at Port Haven, fleeing under fire, leaving behind tanks, guns, and pride. Across the continent, one empire now stretches from the icy fjords of the north to the sunburnt cliffs of the south. Its generals are celebrated as geniuses. Its army is called invincible. Its leader is convinced history has already crowned him. This is the moment when wars are usually decided. And yet, 5 years later, the capital of that same empire is a smoking graveyard. Its army no longer exists. Its leadership is dead or hunted. Its territory is carved up by foreign powers. So what happened? This wasn't chance. It wasn't bad weather. It wasn't secret superweapons used against them. And it certainly wasn't a single battlefield defeat. What destroyed this empire was something far more dangerous. A chain reaction of strategic decisions, each one logical on its own, and catastrophic when combined. Between 1940 and 1945, 10 choices were made. Each choice narrowed the options for the next. Each mistake made retreat harder and recovery impossible. By the time the leadership realized what was happening, the outcome was no longer uncertain. It was inevitable. Today, I'm going to break down the 10 strategic blunders that turned absolute dominance into total annihilation, not through heroics or myths, but through cold planning failures that can be traced step by step. And here's the key thing you need to understand before we begin. These were not random errors. They were connected. Like dominoes, once the first one fell, the rest followed. By 1943, this empire was no longer fighting to win. It was fighting to delay the inevitable. So the real question isn't why they lost. The real question is this. Was there a moment, just one decision, where victory was still possible? Stay with me, because by the end of this video, the answer may not be what you expect. But to understand how everything unraveled, we have to start with what may be the greatest missed opportunity in modern military history. Before we dive in, if you're interested in deep, no-nonsense analysis of World War II strategy, based on primary documents, real numbers, and decisions made at the highest levels, consider subscribing. It helps the channel grow, and it tells me you want more content like this. And as we go through these 10 blunders, leave a comment telling me which one you think sealed their fate. I read every single one. Alright. Summer, 1940. The continent has fallen. The enemy army has escaped across the water, barely. Their island stands alone. And for a brief moment in history, everything is within reach. Yet nothing happens. Why? That answer reveals the fatal flaw that doomed an empire long before its enemies ever reached its capital. And to understand it, you need to see just how close the world came to a very different future. The operation had a name that sounded confident. Directive White. Issued in mid-July 1940, it promised the final blow. An amphibious assault across the narrow sea. A decisive strike that would end the war in the West. The invasion was penciled in for early autumn. But the plan came with conditions, 3 of them. And all 3 had to be met at the same time. First, total control of the skies above the channel. Second, naval dominance to shield the invasion convoys. Third, artillery dominance over the narrow strait separating the continent from the island. Germany failed at every level. The air campaign came first. Fighter squadrons and bomber formations were thrown against island airfields in relentless waves. The goal was simple: destroy the enemy's air force before it could fight back. It never happened. The defenders adapted. Radar stations provided early warning. Fighters were repaired, refueled, and back in the air within hours. And then something deeply uncomfortable began to emerge. The longer the air war dragged on, the worse Germany's position became. Aircraft losses mounted. Experienced pilots were irreplaceable. Meanwhile, factories across the island worked around the clock. New planes rolled off assembly lines faster than old ones were destroyed. Foreign pilots arrived, veterans from shattered nations, volunteers from distant dominions, men with nothing left to lose. Supply ships began arriving from across the ocean. By early autumn, air superiority was no longer a question. It was a failure. The invasion date was pushed back. Then pushed back again. And then, without ceremony, without announcement, the plan faded away. Officially, it still existed. In reality, it was dead. But here's the part that rarely gets discussed. The real failure wasn't that the invasion was postponed. The real failure was that no one in the German military ever agreed on how to do it. The ground forces imagined a rapid landing and breakout. The Air Force believed air power alone could decide the war. The Navy knew, quietly, that the entire operation was a fantasy. Germany's fleet was built for coastal defense, not oceanic warfare. There were no purpose-built landing ships. No doctrine for large-scale amphibious assault. The invasion armada consisted of river barges, civilian tugs, and hastily converted cargo vessels. Each branch planned its own version of the war. They did not train together. They did not coordinate. They did not even share the same assumptions. So the island remained unconquered. And that single fact sealed Germany's fate. Because every month that island survived, the strategic balance shifted. Factories expanded. Ports filled with foreign equipment. Airfields multiplied. The island became something far more dangerous than a surviving enemy. It became a launch platform. Years later, when armies stormed the continent, they departed from those shores. When heavy bombers reduced industrial cities to rubble, they rose from those runways. When the empire was forced to defend every mile of occupied coastline, it was because that island never fell. But in the summer of 1940, none of this seemed urgent. Because the leadership had already turned its attention east. And the next decision would be worse than all the others combined. A decision to open a second war, against a continental giant, while the first was still unresolved. The invasion began before dawn in late June 1941. Across a vast frontier, millions of troops surged forward in the largest military operation humanity had ever attempted. The planners expected victory within weeks. The political leader dismissed the campaign as simple. One hard push, he said. And the structure collapses. It didn't. What followed wasn't just a miscalculation. It was a catastrophic misunderstanding of reality. Military analysts had warned that the enemy's population reserves were enormous. Estimates suggested millions could be mobilized over months. The truth was far worse. Millions appeared in days. Logistics officers raised even more alarming concerns. Supply lines, they said, could not support an advance beyond a few hundred miles. Fuel, ammunition, spare parts, everything would break down. The distance to the political and industrial heartland was double that. Professionals looked at the numbers and said one word. Impossible. The operation went ahead anyway. Because at this moment, strategy stopped guiding decisions. Ideology took over. And once that happened, defeat was no longer a possibility. It was a schedule. Why did it all go so wrong? Because the entire Eastern campaign rested on a belief, not a calculation. The leadership convinced itself that the Eastern Empire was hollow. That its government was fragile. That its people were incapable of sustained resistance. This wasn't intelligence. It was ideology. They assumed the state would crack under pressure. That leadership would flee. That the system would collapse from within. None of that happened. The invasion began at the height of summer. By the time winter arrived, armored columns stood within sight of the capital, out of fuel, short on ammunition, freezing in the open. The lightning victory never came. The government didn't fall. The leadership stayed. And instead of surrender, the defenders struck back. Suddenly, the empire was trapped in the nightmare every strategist warns against. A war in the west. A war in the east. Two fronts. Two consuming conflicts. Every military textbook says the same thing: finish one war before starting another. They ignored it. And then, unbelievably, they went further. Within months, they created a third front. In December 1941, a decision was made that still leaves historians searching for logic. Without being attacked, without necessity, the empire declared war on a distant industrial giant across the ocean. Many people assumed this was automatic. It wasn't. The alliance treaty in place only required support if an ally was attacked. In this case, the ally had struck first. There was no legal obligation. No strategic necessity. There was, however, a catastrophic misunderstanding. Let's rewind. Early December 1941. A surprise attack in the Pacific pulls a neutral superpower into war. The response is immediate, but focused. War is declared on the attacker. And then, days later, something extraordinary happens. The empire voluntarily expands the war. By doing so, it challenges a nation it cannot physically reach. No fleet capable of crossing the ocean. No air force with intercontinental range. No invasion force that could ever touch its shores. But that nation could reach Europe. Its factories were unmatched. Its shipyards limitless. Its manpower effectively inexhaustible. This was not a balanced conflict. This was a strategic gift to the enemy. What the leadership did not know was that the outcome had already been planned. Months earlier, military planners from across the ocean and the island nation had met in secret. They agreed on one principle. If war came, the priority would be Europe. Not Asia. Not the Pacific. The destruction of the continental empire would come first. This wasn't theory. It was signed doctrine. So when war was declared, it didn't create uncertainty. It activated a blueprint. Within hours, political opposition vanished. Votes were unanimous. The population unified overnight. The declaration did what no politician could have achieved alone. It erased hesitation. Now the empire faced three enemies. And while its leaders focused on maps and speeches, something far more dangerous was happening far beyond the front lines in the east. Something intelligence services had dismissed as impossible. Deep in the interior, an entire industrial civilization was on the move. As the invasion advanced, factories were not abandoned. They were dismantled. Machine by machine. Department by department. Worker by worker. Entire production complexes were taken apart, loaded onto trains, and sent east, beyond reach. Not dozens. Thousands. One of the most critical facilities was a tank plant in a western industrial city. It produced the backbone of the defenders' armored force. As enemy units closed in, a decision was made. The plant would not be defended. It would be relocated. Equipment, blueprints, engineers, assembly lines, everything was packed and moved hundreds of miles inland. Within months, production resumed. And not at reduced levels. At higher ones. What the invaders believed would be a short campaign was turning into a war of attrition. And they were about to learn a brutal truth. They weren't fighting an army. They were fighting an entire industrial system, one that had already survived the loss of half its territory and kept growing stronger. And this realization came too late. Because by the time the truth was undeniable, the math of the war had already turned against them. They didn't just save the factory. They moved it. Piece by piece, bolt by bolt, an entire industrial complex was taken apart, loaded onto railcars, and sent nearly 2,000 kilometers east, beyond the reach of enemy aircraft. And it wasn't only machines. Tens of thousands of workers followed. thousands of precision tools. Design documents. Engineers. Supervisors. The chief designer himself stayed with the trains, overseeing every step. All of this happened while enemy units were still advancing toward the city. And this wasn't an isolated case. Another example, a massive steel facility critical for armored production. Workers were told they had just over 2 months to dismantle, relocate, and rebuild it. They finished early. Imagine what that actually means. A steel mill, one of the most complex industrial systems on Earth, taken apart, transported across a continent, and reassembled in less than 60 days. People worked day and night. They slept in tents. They laid rail lines through frozen ground. They rebuilt machine halls while temperatures plunged below zero. By the end of 1941, those factories weren't just operational. They were outperforming pre-war output. And the numbers that followed were staggering. In a single year, the Eastern Power produced nearly 5 times as many tanks as its enemy. Aircraft production surged ahead. Artillery output followed. Small arms. Ammunition. Vehicles. Across the board, production tilted east. Enemy units destroyed equipment at the front faster than their own industry could replace it. Meanwhile, the factories beyond the mountains kept accelerating. Here's the part that should have terrified German planners, but didn't. Foreign observers noticed this coming. Months before the invasion, military attaches reported trains moving east, heavy machinery disappearing from western cities, skilled labor relocating inland. The signs were obvious. The defenders knew war was coming. So now the invaders faced a nightmare scenario. An enemy with deeper manpower reserves. An enemy with expanding industrial capacity. An enemy that could lose territory and still grow stronger. But numbers alone don't win wars. Leadership matters. Doctrine matters. And this is where the next collapse began. Early in the war, German success rested on a revolutionary concept, mission-based command. Officers were given objectives, not scripts. Subordinate commanders had freedom to adapt. Initiative was rewarded. It was fast. Flexible. Deadly. By 1942, that system was gone. Replaced by something rigid and destructive. Let me show you how. During a major summer offensive, German forces were ordered to advance toward 2 separate strategic goals at the same time. Senior officers objected. Splitting forces during an offensive violated basic principles of warfare. The response was not debate. It was obedience. The forces were split. Earlier, during the winter near the capital, field commanders requested permission to withdraw to defensible positions. They weren't retreating in panic. They were trying to survive. The answer was absolute. No movement. No withdrawals. Hold everything. Thousands died where they stood. Not because the ground mattered, but because ideology demanded it. Vehicles froze solid. Weapons failed. Entire units ceased to exist defending positions that offered no strategic advantage. Military judgment was replaced by personal will. And here's the irony. The opposing side learned from its mistakes. Early in the war, their leadership made the same error, refusing retreats, demanding sacrifices for symbolic ground. The cost was horrific. But by 1943, something changed. Operational control shifted to professional commanders. Experienced planners were trusted. Flexibility returned. Doctrine evolved. While one army was loosening its grip, the other was tightening it. The roles reversed. The force once known for professional autonomy became centralized and rigid. The force once crippled by political interference became increasingly competent. And this reversal set the stage for disaster. Because rigid systems break under pressure. And the pressure was about to peak. What came next wasn't just a defeat. It was an annihilation so complete that it destroyed the myth of invincibility forever. And it happened because a system built on trust abandoned it, at the exact moment it needed it most. The collapse didn't come all at once. It came as a single, irreversible catastrophe. An entire field army, nearly 300,000 men, was erased. Not crushed in a climactic charge. Not defeated in open battle. But sealed inside a pocket and left to die. The place was a ruined industrial city on a wide river bend. Late summer, 1942. German columns reached the outskirts of Volgograd on the Volga, a city whose name carried enormous symbolic weight. It bore the name of the enemy's leader. Capturing it promised prestige, headlines, and political theater. From a strategic standpoint, however, it was a distraction. The real prize lay far to the south, the oil fields that powered tanks, aircraft, and trucks. Fuel, not cities, was the lifeblood of the war. But symbolism took over. What began as a limited operation became a grinding urban nightmare. Street by street. Building by building. Room by room. The kind of fighting that neutralized armor, aircraft, and maneuver. Months passed. Losses mounted. Instead of disengaging, more units were fed into the ruins. The city became an obsession. Then, in late autumn, the defenders struck back, not where anyone expected. They ignored the city. They attacked the sides. In mid-November, a massive counteroffensive exploded across the open flanks north and south of the battlefield. These sectors weren't held by elite formations. They were guarded by Allied units with outdated equipment and thin reserves. The lines shattered. Armored formations punched through and raced westward. Within days, they met behind the city. The trap snapped shut. Hundreds of thousands were now encircled. At this moment, escape was still possible. The commander on the ground understood this. Urgent messages were sent to high command. Break out now. Routes are still open. Delay means destruction. The answer came from the top. Hold the city. Relief would come from the air. A senior Air Force commander personally guaranteed that supply aircraft could sustain the trapped army. The numbers didn't support the promise. The surrounded force needed hundreds of tons of supplies every single day: food, fuel, ammunition, medicine. The aircraft delivered a fraction of that. Winter closed in. Rations disappeared. Wounded men froze without treatment. Temperatures plunged to levels where metal shattered and flesh failed. By early January, the final assault began. There was no breakout. There was no rescue. In early February 1943, the remaining survivors surrendered. Tens of thousands marched into captivity. Only a few thousand would ever see home again. The human cost was beyond comprehension. Entire divisions ceased to exist. Equipment losses were irreplaceable. And while the defenders suffered enormous casualties of their own, they could replace them. The invaders could not. This wasn't just a defeat. It was a psychological rupture. The myth of invincibility died in the snow. And yet, this should have been a lesson. It wasn't. Because the order that sealed the fate of that army, hold at all costs, became doctrine. Again. And again. And again. Across the front, units were told to stand fast regardless of circumstance. Positions without strategic value were defended to annihilation. When encirclement came, retreat was forbidden. The pattern repeated. One pocket after another. Entire formations destroyed not because they had to fight, but because they were not allowed to move. And here's the tragic irony. The obsession with holding ground came from a single earlier success. In one isolated case, an encircled force had been resupplied from the air and survived. Leadership drew the wrong conclusion. They assumed what worked once could work everywhere. They ignored scale. They ignored weather. They ignored logistics. And by the time reality reasserted itself, the damage was irreversible. Because rigid orders in a fluid war don't create strength. They create graves. And this obsession with control, this refusal to adapt, would continue to bleed the army dry long after the ruins of that city had faded into memory. There was a reason the catastrophe at the river city felt possible. Months earlier, an encircled force had survived. In early 1942, roughly 100,000 troops were cut off in a remote northern sector. Against the odds, aircraft kept them supplied. After months of isolation, they broke free. From that single success, a dangerous belief was born. If air supply worked once, it could work again. What leadership ignored were the differences. That earlier pocket was smaller. The distances were shorter. The weather was survivable. The later encirclement was 3 times larger, hundreds of kilometers farther, and locked in one of the harshest winters on Earth. But the precedent had been set. A gamble that should have been rejected now seemed reasonable. And it led directly to annihilation. By 1943, the consequences were everywhere. Entire formations vanished on the Eastern Front. At the same time, the Empire was bleeding forces across the map. Southern Europe. Western Europe. The North. The Balkans. Units were scattered in garrisons and secondary theaters, unable to reinforce one another. This is the hidden cost of overextension. When you try to be strong everywhere, you are strong nowhere. By the summer of 1944, the imbalance was fatal. Dozens of divisions faced the Western Allies. Far more were locked in the East. Others were trapped in Italy, pinned down in mountains and ruins. The defenders had no strategic reserve. Meanwhile, the attackers had freedom. They could choose the time. They could choose the place. The High Command had to guess. And they guessed wrong. Expecting a southern blow, they shifted forces away from the central sector. Artillery was moved. Armored units redeployed. Defensive depth was stripped away. What remained looked intact on paper. In reality, it was hollow. When the attack came, it didn't just break the line. It erased it. An entire army group disintegrated in weeks. The losses exceeded even the disaster of the river city. And the reason was simple. There was nothing left to stop it. By late 1944, the reality was unavoidable. Production was collapsing. Manpower was exhausted. Territory was shrinking on every front. So leadership reached for a miracle. If numbers couldn't win the war, technology would. The focus shifted to revolutionary weapons. Jet aircraft. Long-range missiles. Exotic armored designs. Some of these machines were extraordinary. But they arrived in the wrong war. Take the jet fighter. In combat, it was untouchable. Faster than anything in the sky. Heavily armed. Deadly in the hands of experienced pilots. In its first encounters, small numbers tore through massive bomber formations without loss. On paper, it looked like salvation. In reality, it was a trap. Only a fraction of the aircraft built ever reached operational units. Even fewer flew regularly. The engines wore out in hours. Maintenance consumed resources that no longer existed. Critical materials were unavailable. Worse still, production was delayed and diluted by constant redesigns and misused roles. Dozens were destroyed on the ground before they ever took off. And then there were the rockets. A technological leap decades ahead of its time. And strategically meaningless. Enormous resources were poured into weapons that terrorized civilians but couldn't change the course of the war. Those same resources could have produced thousands of tanks, fighters, or trucks. Weapons that win battles, not headlines. By the end, leadership understood the truth. They could no longer compete in factories. They could no longer replace losses. They could no longer control events. The pursuit of miracle weapons wasn't a plan to win. It was an admission of defeat. And that brings us back to the question we started with. Was defeat inevitable? Not in 1940. Not even in 1941. But once these decisions stacked on top of one another, missed opportunities, ideological blinders, rigid command, catastrophic overextension, and technological distraction, the outcome became locked in. The most powerful military machine in history didn't collapse because of a single enemy. It destroyed itself. One decision at a time.